Close your eyes and imagine a galaxy where the most ancient darkness never truly faded. Picture an immortal Sith Emperor, his consciousness preserved through rituals so terrible they consumed entire worlds, watching and waiting as the centuries rolled past, like grains of sand through an hourglass. The Skywalker saga as we know it becomes something entirely different when you introduce a predator who has been hunting for over 3,000 years, whose patience is measured in millennia, and whose understanding of the Force makes even the most powerful Sith Lords seem like children playing with fire. This is the story of what happens when Vitiate, the Sith Emperor who drained the life from an entire planet to achieve immortality, never truly fell. What if his consciousness, that ancient and terrible intelligence, survived beyond the canonical timeline where heroes defeated him? What if, instead of being destroyed by the Jedi Knight, known as the Hero of Tython, he merely withdrew, reconsidered his approach, and decided to play a longer game? The galaxy would face not just Palpatine's empire, not just the First Order's fanaticism, but something far older and infinitely more patient. The tale of the Skywalkers becomes a multi-generational struggle against an enemy who has already lived through the rise and fall of entire civilizations, who has seen empires crumble and been reborn from their ashes. Anakin, Luke, Leia, Ben, and Rey would all become pieces on a game board that spans not decades, but thousands of years, manipulated by a consciousness that views mortals the way we might view mayflies, ephemeral and ultimately inconsequential, except for what they can provide. In our timeline, Vitiate fell to the combined efforts of the Jedi Knight and their companions sometime around 3,600 years before the Battle of Yavin. His eternal empire crumbled, his children Arcan and Thexan waged their wars, and eventually the galaxy moved on, forgetting the terror that the immortal Emperor had represented. But in this alternate reality, something changed. Perhaps the killing blow never quite landed. Perhaps Vitiate had prepared yet another vessel, another contingency that even his own followers never knew about. Perhaps his consciousness simply refused to disperse, clinging to existence through sheer force of will and dark side mastery. Whatever the mechanism, Vitiate survived. His physical form might have been destroyed, but his essence endured, a cancer of consciousness that retreated into the unknown regions, into forgotten temples and ancient dark side nexuses, rebuilding his strength one carefully stolen life at a time. He watched as the old republic eventually collapsed under its own weight and corruption. He observed as the Sith Empire he had once ruled faded into legend and myth. He saw new Sith Lords rise and fall, their ambitions burning bright and brief like shooting stars against the endless night. The galaxy entered what historians would call the age of the modern Sith, the era of Darth Bane and his rule of two. Vitiate watched this development with interest. Bane's philosophy was sound in its way, a solution to the constant infighting that had plagued the Sith for generations. But it was also limiting, too restrictive for someone who had commanded armies of dark side warriors. Still, Vitiate recognized that in this new age, he would need to adapt his approach. No longer could he simply conquer through overwhelming force. The galaxy had changed, and he would need to change with it. So he waited. Century after century, he waited and watched and slowly, carefully built his strength. He established hidden strongholds in the unknown regions, places of such concentrated dark side power that they would serve as anchors for his immortal consciousness. He cultivated cults of followers who worshipped him as a god, feeding him their life force in rituals that sustained his unnatural existence. He studied the new Sith who emerged, learning their techniques and philosophies, always gathering knowledge like a dragon hoarding gold. By the time the Skywalker saga was about to begin, Vitiate had been observing and manipulating galactic events from the shadows for over 3,000 years. He had become something beyond a mere Sith Lord. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the dark side's most terrible truth. That power, once achieved, can endure forever, if you are willing to pay any price to maintain it. The Phantom Menace? Ancient eyes on young Anakin. The trade, Federation's blockade of Naboo, seemed like a minor dispute in the grand scope of galactic politics, a trade disagreement that had escalated into military action. The Senate debated and delayed, while an entire planet suffered. But in the shadows beyond known space, an ancient intelligence took notice not of the blockade, but of something else entirely. Vitiate felt it the moment Qui-Gon Jinn discovered the boy on Tatooine, a disturbance in the Force so profound it rippled across the galaxy like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Anakin Skywalker, a child with no father, born of the Force itself, carrying a midi-chlorian count that exceeded even the legendary Jedi of old. Vitiate had lived long enough to recognize patterns in the Force, to understand that certain individuals were destined for greatness or terrible power. This boy was special in ways that most Force sensitives could never comprehend. He was a vergence in the Force, a living nexus of potential that could tip the balance between light and dark. The Sith Emperor immediately understood what the Jedi Council, in their wisdom and caution, could only fear. This child was not just powerful, he was malleable, vulnerable, filled with attachments and fears that could be exploited. He was exactly the kind of individual who could be shaped into the ultimate weapon, or the ultimate servant. Vitiate had seen the rise and fall of countless Force users, had corrupted Jedi, and trained Sith, but this boy represented something new, something unprecedented. But Vitiate also sensed he was not alone in his interest. Another presence, another Sith Lord, had already set machinations in motion. Darth Sidious, the secret identity of Senator Palpatine, had been orchestrating the events on Naboo, and throughout the Republic for years. His plan to take control of the galaxy was already well underway, and young Anakin was a piece he had not anticipated, but would surely seek to claim. This created a fascinating dilemma for the ancient Emperor. He could reveal himself now, emerge from millennia of hiding to claim this prize before Sidious could corrupt the boy. But such an action would be premature, would expose him before he had fully prepared for his return. Vitiate had learned patience through centuries of waiting. He could afford to observe, to let Sidious make his moves, while the Emperor positioned his own pieces on the board. So Vitiate watched as Qui-Gon brought Anakin before the Jedi Council. He felt the boy's fear and excitement as he was tested. He sensed Master Yoda's concern, that ancient Jedi's recognition that this child carried darkness within him, alongside his incredible potential. The Council's decision to initially refuse training showed wisdom, but it was a wisdom that would ultimately be overruled by circumstance and tragedy. When Qui-Gon Jinn fell to Darth Maul's blade on Naboo, Vitiate observed with clinical interest. The Jedi Master's dying wish that Obi-Wan train the boy would prove to be a critical moment, a decision that would echo through the decades to come. The Council, honoring their fallen member, agreed to allow Anakin's training despite their reservations. The first domino in a long chain had been toppled, and the Sith Emperor could see where it would ultimately lead. But Vitiate did more than simply observe. He began to carefully, almost imperceptibly, touch the edges of young Anakin's dreams. Not enough to alert the Jedi to outside influence, but enough to plant seeds that would grow over time. He sent visions of power, of the ability to protect those the boy loved, of strength sufficient to prevent any loss. These dreams were so subtle, so natural-seeming, that Anakin would never recognize them as external manipulations. They simply felt like his own deepest desires, bubbling up from his subconscious. The Emperor also took interest in the changing political landscape. Palpatine's election as Supreme Chancellor was a masterful move, positioning the Sith Lord at the heart of galactic power. Vitiate recognized the brilliance of the plan, the way Sidious was corrupting the Republic from within, rather than trying to conquer it from without. It was a strategy worthy of respect, even if it meant waiting longer to claim the galaxy for himself. Throughout Anakin's early years of training, Vitiate maintained his distant vigil. He watched as the boy struggled with the Jedi Code, as his attachment to his mother remained strong, despite the Order's teachings about letting go. He observed the friendship that developed between Anakin and the young Senator Padme Amidala, recognizing that this bond too would serve as a potential pressure point in the years to come. The ancient Emperor established agents within both the Republic and the growing separatist movement, not to control events as Sidious was doing, but to observe and gather information. These agents, often not even aware they served the power beyond the Sith they knew, sent reports back to the unknown regions where Vitiate processed every detail, building a comprehensive understanding of the new galactic order. 10 years passed, and the boy became a young man. Anakin Skywalker grew powerful, perhaps too powerful for his age and experience. His frustration with the Jedi Council's caution, his arrogance born of natural talent, his secret marriage to Padme Amidala, in defiance of the Jedi Code, all of these developments Vitiate noted and catalogued. The seeds, planted in dreams years ago, had found fertile soil in a mind already predisposed toward attachment and the desire for control. When the Clone Wars erupted, Vitiate saw it for what it was: Palpatine's masterstroke, a manufactured conflict designed to grant him emergency powers and position him to eventually transform the Republic into an empire. It was elegant in its way, using democracy's own mechanisms to subvert it from within, but it was also an opportunity for the ancient emperor to test the waters, to see how his own forces might fare in this new age of warfare. The Clone Wars, a shadow beneath shadows. The galaxy burned with war, and in that fire, both Palpatine and Vitiate saw opportunity. But whereas Sidious sought to control every aspect of the conflict, orchestrating both sides toward his ultimate goal, Vitiate played a subtler game. He did not need the Clone Wars to end in any particular way. He simply needed them to create the chaos and suffering that would feed the dark side and weaken the institutions that might oppose him when he finally chose to reveal himself. The Jedi Order, stretched thin across countless battlefields, became blind to threats that did not come wearing separatist colors. This blindness created opportunities. Vitiate began to carefully extend his influence, reaching out through the Force to Jedi, who found themselves isolated on distant worlds, worn down by constant combat, traumatized by the horrors of war. Not all of them fell to his whispers, but some did, and those who did became his eyes and ears within the Order itself. One such Jedi was a consular named Jarek Thon, stationed in the Outer Rim territories where the war raged hottest. Thon had witnessed too much death, had been forced to make too many impossible choices between saving soldiers under his command and adhering to the Jedi Code. His faith in the Order's teachings had been shaken by the reality of war, and in his meditations he began to hear a voice that promised him the power to end suffering through strength rather than passive peace. Vitiate never revealed his true identity to Thon or others like him. He appeared in visions as a benevolent guide, an ancient Jedi master who had learned secrets the current order had forgotten. He taught them techniques that drew on their emotions, that used their pain and anger as fuel for power. By the time these corrupted Jedi realized they were studying dark side techniques, they were already too deep to turn back, and the voice in their meditations had become the only thing that made sense in a galaxy that seemed to have abandoned reason. These fallen Jedi did not join the Separatists or reveal themselves to Palpatine's Sith. Instead, they remained in their positions, gathering information and waiting for orders that would come at some future date. They were Vitiate's insurance policy, his hidden force that could be activated when the timing was right. If Sidious succeeded in his plan, these corrupted Jedi might survive the Purge by already being dark side practitioners. If Sidious failed, they would be positioned to seize power in the chaos. But Vitiate's attention remained primarily focused on Anakin Skywalker. The young Jedi Knight had become a hero of the Republic, his exploits in battle legendary, his power in the Force growing with each confrontation. He had taken a Padawan, Ahsoka Tano, and in teaching her, Anakin revealed both his capacity for compassion and his tendency toward unorthodox methods that troubled the Council. The Emperor watched with particular interest when Anakin encountered the Force wielders on Mortis, beings of incredible power representing the light, the dark, and the balance. The father, the son, and the daughter existed outside normal space and time, and their interest in Anakin confirmed what Vitiate had suspected. This young man was truly special, potentially the chosen one prophesied to bring balance to the Force. Balance. The concept amused Vitiate in a dark way. The Jedi interpreted balance as the destruction of the Sith, but Vitiate understood that true balance would require equal measures of light and dark. If Anakin was indeed the chosen one, then his destiny was not to eliminate the darkness, but to exist at the fulcrum point between extremes. That made him even more valuable, even more necessary to claim before Sidious could corrupt him beyond redemption. Throughout the war, Vitiate also observed Palpatine's apprentice, Count Dooku, or Darth Tyrannus, as the Sith knew him. The former Jedi Master was a skilled manipulator and warrior, but he was also clearly a pawn, a temporary tool that Sidious would discard once Anakin was ready to take his place. Vitiate had used similar tactics over his long existence, training apprentices only to consume them when their power reached its peak, feeding on their strength to sustain his immortality. The ancient Emperor began to plant specific visions in Anakin's dreams during this period. He showed the young Jedi shadowy futures, where Padme died, where his loved ones perished because he lacked the power to save them. These nightmares, which Anakin believed were premonitions, fed his desperation and fear. They made him more susceptible to the temptations that Palpatine would eventually offer, but they also created an underlying current of paranoia and dread that Vitiate could exploit later. On the battlefield, Vitiate occasionally intervened in subtle ways. A separatist commander who might have destroyed Anakin's forces suddenly made a tactical error. A Jedi, who was getting too close to uncovering Palpatine's deception, found themselves transferred to a different sector. These interventions were so minor, so easily attributed to chance or the fog of war, that no one recognized them as the work of an outside intelligence. But they helped ensure that the Clone Wars would proceed along the path that served Vitiate's long-term interests. The Emperor also took interest in other Force-sensitive individuals who emerged during the war. The Night Sisters of Dathomir, with their unique approach to the dark side, fascinated him. When Mother Talzin attempted to manipulate events through her son Maul and his brother Savage Opress, Vitiate observed to see if she might prove useful. Ultimately, he decided against recruiting her. She was too independent, too tied to her own agenda and her own people. She would never serve him with the absolute loyalty he required. Asajj Ventress, Count Dooku's former apprentice, represented another interesting case. Her fall from the Jedi and subsequent betrayal by the Sith left her adrift, neither truly light nor truly dark. Vitiate recognized that such individuals could be valuable precisely because they were not bound by the dogma of either order. He sent agents to observe her, to occasionally offer anonymous assistance that would make her feel indebted to an unknown benefactor. She might prove useful in the future if properly motivated. As the Clone Wars entered their third year, Vitiate could sense the endgame approaching. Palpatine's manipulations were reaching their crescendo. the Jedi were more isolated and blind than ever, trusted by the public, but increasingly viewed with suspicion by the Senate. Anakin's power had grown to rival the greatest Jedi masters, but his emotional control had not kept pace. He was a weapon forged in the fires of war, sharp and deadly, but also brittle, ready to shatter under the right pressure. The Emperor made his own preparations. In the unknown regions, his loyal cults had been gathering resources and building infrastructure. His eternal fleet, mothballed for thousands of years, was being slowly reactivated and upgraded with modern technology. His ancient strongholds were being reinforced and stocked with supplies. When the time came to emerge from the shadows, he would not do so as a refugee or a weakened exile, but as a force capable of challenging whatever order arose from the ashes of the Republic. He also established multiple contingency plans, learning from his observations of both the Jedi and the Sith. If Sidious succeeded in corrupting Anakin and establishing his empire, Vitiate would wait for the inevitable moment when the apprentice betrayed the master. If Sidious failed, and the Jedi somehow survived, Vitiate would position himself as a rallying point for dark side users scattered across the galaxy. If some third outcome emerged, something neither he nor Sidious had anticipated, his distributed network of agents and resources would allow him to adapt. But most importantly, Vitiate made sure that no matter what happened, his connection to Anakin Skywalker would remain. The seeds planted in dreams, the subtle influences that had shaped the young man's fears and desires, these would endure. Even if Sidious claimed Anakin first, Vitiate would have left his mark, a backdoor into the soul of the most powerful Force user in generations. The Clone Wars raged on, and the galaxy had no idea that the conflict it thought was orchestrated by one Sith Lord was actually being influenced by two, each playing for stakes far higher than anyone could imagine. Order 66, the day, everything changed. The moment came without warning for most, but Vitiate had felt it building for months, like pressure before a storm. Palpatine finally made his move, manipulating Anakin's desperate fear for Padme into the final push toward the dark side. The ancient Emperor watched through the Force as events unfolded with terrible inevitability. Mace Windu's confrontation with Palpatine in the Chancellor's office was the fulcrum point. Vitiate observed as Anakin burst into the room, torn between his duty to the Jedi Order and his desperate need to learn the secrets that might save his wife. He felt the young man's anguish as he made his choice, striking down Windu and pledging himself to Darth Sidious as Darth Vader. The irony did not escape Vitiate. He had spent years preparing to claim this powerful Force user, only to watch Palpatine snatch him away in a single moment of weakness. But the ancient Emperor was patient. He had learned over millennia that initial setbacks often led to greater opportunities. Vader might serve Sidious now, but time and circumstance could change that allegiance. Then came Order 66, and the galaxy was bathed in blood. Across thousands of worlds, clone troopers turned on their Jedi generals, gunning them down without hesitation or remorse. The programming hidden in their genetic code activated simultaneously, transforming loyal soldiers into efficient executioners. The Jedi Order, already weakened by 3 years of war, was decimated in hours. Vitiate felt each death through the Force, thousands of lights snuffed out in rapid succession. The dark side swelled with power, gorging itself on the fear and pain of so many deaths, happening simultaneously. For a lesser Sith, this would have been a feast beyond imagining. For Vitiate, it was merely confirmation that Palpatine was more capable than he had given him credit for. To orchestrate such a complete betrayal, such total destruction, required planning and ruthlessness worthy of the ancient Sith Lords. But not all Jedi died. Some survived through luck, skill, or the compassion of clones who resisted their programming. Obi-Wan Kenobi escaped on Utapau. Yoda survived on Kashyyyk. And scattered across the galaxy, a handful of Jedi went into hiding, becoming the seeds of a resistance that would eventually challenge the New Order. Vitiate immediately dispatched his agents to locate these survivors, not to kill them, but to observe and occasionally assist without revealing themselves. A Jedi in hiding, consumed by survivors' guilt and rage, could be corrupted given time and the right pressure. Some of the survivors would eventually fall to the dark side naturally. Others could be guided toward that fall with careful manipulation. The transformation of the Republic into the Galactic Empire proceeded with shocking speed. Palpatine addressed the Senate, declaring the Jedi traitors and announcing the formation of a new regime to ensure security and stability. The senators, manipulated by years of emergency powers and propaganda, cheered their own subjugation. Democracy died to thunderous applause, just as Padme Amidala observed in her final coherent moments. Vitiate watched Anakin's fall into darkness with particular attention. The young man's assault on the Jedi Temple, slaughtering even the younglings, marked his complete surrender to the dark side. But it was his duel with Obi-Wan on Mustafar that truly sealed his fate. Burned and broken, reduced to a quadruple amputee, kept alive only through dark side power and cybernetic enhancement, Darth Vader was born from the ashes of Anakin Skywalker. The ancient emperor studied this transformation with the eye of a scientist, examining a fascinating specimen. Vader's pain and rage made him incredibly powerful in the dark side, but they also made him controllable. Palpatine had created the perfect enforcer, powerful enough to crush any opposition, but too damaged, physically and psychologically, to effectively challenge his master. It was elegant and brutal in equal measure. But Vitiate also recognized the instability in this arrangement. Vader's suffering was constant, an unending torment that could only be dulled, never truly eliminated. That suffering fueled his power, but also created a reservoir of hatred that was not entirely directed toward the Jedi or the rebellion. Some of that hatred was directed inward, at himself for his failures. And some, whether Vader acknowledged it or not, was directed at the master who kept him in this state of perpetual agony. The births of Luke and Leia Skywalker did not escape Vitiate's notice. The Force rippled with their arrival, two new lights in a galaxy growing darker. Palpatine, focused on consolidating his empire and training his new apprentice, seemed unaware that Vader's children had survived. Vitiate chose not to enlighten him. The twins represented a future opportunity, a potential weakness in Vader that could be exploited, or a potential source of powerful Force-sensitive apprentices who carried the Skywalker bloodline. When Padme died, Vitiate felt Vader's anguish echo across the galaxy. The belief that he had killed his wife in his rage completed Vader's emotional destruction. He had sacrificed everything to gain the power to save her, and in doing so, he had destroyed her. That paradox would define him for decades to come, a wound that would never fully heal, a source of dark power but also of potential redemption that Vitiate would need to account for in his long-term plans. The Jedi Order was broken, scattered, hunted to near extinction. The Sith ruled the galaxy openly for the first time in 1,000 years. Palpatine's empire began constructing massive military forces, including the Death Star superweapon that would cement their control through fear. From a certain point of view, the dark side had won completely, but Vitiate knew better. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had watched the Sith achieve total victory before, only to destroy themselves through infighting and hubris. Palpatine's empire might dominate the known galaxy, but it was built on fear and oppression, which inevitably bred resistance. And more importantly, Palpatine himself was vulnerable in ways he didn't fully recognize. The ancient emperor withdrew to his strongholds in the unknown regions and began the next phase of his plan. He would let Palpatine enjoy his triumph. He would allow the empire to consolidate its power and hunt down the remaining Jedi. He would watch as inevitable resistance movements began to form, scattered at first, but growing stronger over time. And while all of this played out, Vitiate would build his own forces, updated and modernized for this new age. He would corrupt more Force sensitives who escaped Imperial notice. He would establish trade networks and information systems that penetrated deep into both Imperial and Rebel territories. He would prepare for the day when the galaxy, exhausted by conflict between Empire and Rebellion, would be ripe for conquest by a third force that few even remembered was possible. The Skywalker bloodline was now scattered. Vader serving Palpatine in torment and rage, Luke hidden on Tatooine under the protection of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Leia hidden on Alderaan as the adopted daughter of Senator Bail Organa. Vitiate filed away the locations of all three, valuable pieces on a game board that would take decades to fully develop. Order 66 had changed everything, but for an immortal Sith Emperor, it was merely another chapter in a story that had been unfolding for millennia. The Clone Wars had ended. The Empire had risen, and in the unknown regions, ancient darkness waited with infinite patience for its moment to reclaim the galaxy. 19 years passed in the shadow of Imperial rule, and the galaxy learned what true oppression felt like. Stormtroopers patrolled every major world. Star destroyers hung in orbit above planets that dared show even the slightest dissent. The Empire's reach extended to the farthest corners of known space, and anyone who remembered the Old Republic learned to keep their nostalgia to themselves, or risk a visit from Imperial security. But beneath the surface of Palpatine's seemingly absolute control, other forces were stirring. Vitiate had not been idle during these years of Imperial consolidation. While Palpatine focused on building his military might and hunting down the last remnants of the Jedi, the ancient Emperor was constructing something far more insidious. He was building an empire within the Empire, a network of influence that touched every level of Imperial hierarchy without anyone realizing they were serving two masters. The method was subtle and ingenious. Vitiate never directly approached high-ranking Imperial officials or made his presence known to those loyal to Palpatine. Instead, he worked through intermediaries and proxies, establishing what appeared to be independent criminal organizations, mercenary companies, and fringe religious cults. These groups operated on the edges of Imperial space, where central authority was weaker and local commanders had more autonomy. One such organization was the Immortal Covenant, a dark side cult that worshipped an ancient Sith Emperor whose name had been lost to time. They recruited Force-sensitive individuals who had escaped Imperial notice, training them in techniques that drew heavily on Vitiate's own knowledge. These acolytes believed they were preserving ancient Sith teachings, never realizing that the god they worshipped was very much alive, and using them as a distributed network of dark side practitioners. Through the Covenant and similar groups, Vitiate slowly accumulated a growing army of Force users, loyal to him rather than to Palpatine. They were not as powerful as Vader or the Emperor's Inquisitors, but they were numerous and scattered across the galaxy in ways that made them difficult to track or eliminate. More importantly, they operated in regions where the Empire's attention was focused elsewhere, building their strength in the shadows of Palpatine's shadow. Vitiate also took great interest in the Inquisitorius, Palpatine's order of dark side assassins, tasked with hunting down surviving Jedi. These fallen Jedi and Force sensitives had been corrupted and trained in dark side techniques, then bound to the Empire through fear and conditioning. Some of them, like the Grand Inquisitor, were formidable warriors in their own right, but they were also broken individuals, their identities stripped away and replaced with numbers and titles. The ancient Emperor saw opportunity in their misery. Through careful manipulation of the Force, he began to reach out to individual Inquisitors during their meditations. He appeared to them as visions of power beyond what Palpatine offered, as the promise of freedom from their servitude. Not all of them responded to his call, but some did, creating yet another network of potential agents within the Imperial structure itself. One Inquisitor, known only as the Seventh Sister, became particularly receptive to these visions. She had been a Jedi Padawan before Order 66, captured rather than killed, and broken through torture and conditioning until she joined the Inquisitorius. But unlike some of her fellows, she had never fully surrendered her identity to the Empire. She remembered who she had been, and that memory was a wound that never healed. When Vitiate's consciousness touched her mind during meditation, offering her knowledge and power that the Empire withheld, she listened. She did not know who or what was speaking to her through the Force, but she recognized that it was not Palpatine or Vader. That was enough to make her curious, to make her receptive to teachings that came from outside the Imperial hierarchy. Without ever meeting her benefactor, the Seventh Sister became an unwitting agent of the ancient Emperor, feeding information back to the unknown regions through methods she believed were her own discoveries. Meanwhile, Vader himself became a subject of intense study for Vitiate. The ancient Emperor watched through the Force as Palpatine's apprentice carried out mission after mission, hunting Jedi, crushing rebellions, serving as the Empire's iron fist. But Vitiate also observed the internal conflict that raged within the Sith Lord. Vader's grief for Padme, his buried feelings for the Jedi he had once called friends, his unconscious awareness that somewhere, somehow, the children he believed he had killed might have survived. All of these emotions created fractures in his commitment to the dark side. Vitiate recognized these fractures as potential entry points. He began to, very carefully, almost imperceptibly, touch the edges of Vader's dreams. Not enough to alert Palpatine, who kept close watch on his apprentice, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. Visions of a hooded figure who offered knowledge beyond what Palpatine possessed. Dreams of power sufficient to overthrow the Emperor and claim the galaxy for himself. Whispers that suggested Vader's children might have survived, that there might be another path forward besides eternal servitude. These influences were so subtle that Vader himself was not consciously aware of them. They simply felt like his own thoughts, his own desires bubbling up from the depths of his tormented psyche. But they created an undercurrent of restlessness that would eventually manifest in ways that neither Palpatine nor Vader himself anticipated. On Tatooine, Luke Skywalker grew from infant to young man under the watchful eye of Obi-Wan Kenobi. The old Jedi Master had taken on the identity of a hermit named Ben, living in the Jundland wastes while secretly monitoring Luke from a distance. Vitiate was aware of Luke's existence and location, but he chose not to interfere. The boy was being raised by his aunt and uncle, simple moisture farmers with no connection to the Force. He was being kept ignorant of his heritage, his powers dormant and untrained. This served Vitiate's purposes perfectly. An untrained Force sensitive of Luke's potential represented a blank slate, someone who could be molded without the need to first break through years of Jedi indoctrination. When the time came, Luke Skywalker could be approached with offers of power and knowledge, and without the bias that came from being raised in the Jedi Temple, he might be more receptive to teachings that drew from both light and dark. On Alderaan, Leia Organa was growing up in very different circumstances. As the adopted daughter of Senator Bail Organa, she was being trained in politics and diplomacy, groomed to eventually take her father's place in the Imperial Senate. She too was Force-sensitive, though her abilities remained undiscovered and untrained. But unlike Luke, Leia was being raised in an environment that actively opposed the Empire, surrounded by individuals who remembered the Republic and worked in secret to undermine Palpatine's regime. Vitiate observed both twins with equal interest. They represented different approaches to the same genetic legacy, two paths that might eventually intersect in ways that would determine the fate of the Skywalker bloodline. He made no move to interfere with either child's development, content to let them grow naturally, until the moment when their paths would inevitably bring them into the larger galactic conflict, The formation of the Rebel Alliance around 2 years before the Battle of Yavin caught Palpatine's attention, but did not overly concern him. Scattered resistance cells coordinating their activities represented more of an annoyance than a true threat to Imperial power. The Emperor saw the rebellion as a useful tool for identifying dissidents who could then be eliminated, keeping the rest of the galaxy fearful and compliant through displays of overwhelming force. But Vitiate recognized something that Palpatine, in his arrogance, overlooked. The rebellion was not just a military force. It was an idea, a symbol of hope that resisted the Empire's efforts to crush it through brute force. Ideas were harder to kill than people, and symbols could survive defeats that would destroy conventional armies. The rebellion might be weak now, but it had the potential to grow into something significant, especially if properly motivated by Imperial atrocities. And Vitiate had every intention of encouraging those atrocities. Through his network of agents and proxies, he began to subtly influence Imperial commanders in ways that would make them more brutal, more prone to overreaction. A suggestion here, a planted piece of intelligence there, actions that would lead to civilian casualties and push neutral systems toward supporting the rebellion. Every act of Imperial cruelty that drove more people into the arms of the resistance served Vitiate's purposes by further destabilizing Palpatine's regime. The ancient Emperor was playing a game with a timeline measured in decades rather than years. He understood that Palpatine's empire, for all its military might, was fundamentally unsustainable. It was built on fear, and fear could maintain control only so long as the population believed resistance was futile. But the more the Empire demonstrated its cruelty, the more people would find the courage to resist. And every act of resistance, no matter how small, would inspire others. Vitiate's goal was not to help the rebellion defeat the Empire. His goal was to weaken both sides through prolonged conflict, creating a galaxy so exhausted by war that when he finally revealed himself and offered a third alternative, people would embrace it simply because they wanted the fighting to end. It was a strategy he had employed before, thousands of years ago, and it had worked then. There was no reason to believe it would not work again. As the years passed and the children of Anakin Skywalker approached adulthood, Vitiate continued to build his forces in the unknown regions. His eternal fleet was being modernized with technology that rivaled anything the Empire possessed. His army of dark side cultists trained in techniques that predated even the Sith of Darth Bane's era. His network of agents penetrated every level of both Imperial and Rebel hierarchies, gathering information and preparing for the day when they would be activated. The galaxy was moving toward a confrontation that few could see coming. Palpatine believed his empire was eternal, that he had finally achieved the Sith's ancient dream of total galactic domination. The rebellion believed they were fighting for freedom, for the restoration of democracy and justice. Vader believed he had lost everything that mattered, and now served only out of habit and darkness. None of them knew that an enemy older and more patient than anything they had faced before was watching them all, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim a galaxy he believed rightfully belonged to him. The stage was set. The players were moving into position, and in the unknown regions, Vitiate smiled his ancient, terrible smile and prepared for the endgame. A new hope. When old and new collide, the theft of the Death Star plans marked the beginning of the end for Palpatine's empire, though no one realized it at the time. Princess Leia Organa's desperate mission to deliver those plans to the rebellion set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the galaxy, but it also drew the attention of beings far older than the galactic civil war. When Leia's ship was captured above Tatooine, and she hid the plans in R2-D2, sending the little droid off into the desert with instructions to find Obi-Wan Kenobi, she could not have known that this act would bring together the scattered pieces of the Skywalker legacy. Nor could she have known that this convergence was being observed with intense interest by an intelligence that had been manipulating galactic events for thousands of years. Vitiate felt the disturbance in the Force when Luke Skywalker finally began his journey toward his destiny. The young man's encounter with the droids, his meeting with Obi-Wan, the revelation of his heritage and his father's supposed death, all of these moments rippled through the Force like stones dropped in still water. But more significant was the moment when Obi-Wan placed his father's lightsaber in Luke's hands and began to teach him about the Force. The ancient Emperor recognized this as a critical juncture. For 19 years, Luke had been essentially invisible, a potential that remained unfulfilled. Now he was awakening to his power, beginning a journey that would inevitably bring him into conflict with the Empire, and more specifically, with his own father. This was exactly the kind of situation that Vitiate had been waiting for. The convergence of powerful bloodlines and galactic conflict that created opportunities for manipulation on a grand scale. But Vitiate also recognized that this was not yet the moment to reveal himself. Luke was still too inexperienced, too committed to the ideals that Obi-Wan was teaching him. The boy would need to be tested, broken down, and rebuilt through hardship and loss before he would be receptive to the truths that the ancient Emperor could offer. Patience remained the key. The destruction of Alderaan by the Death Star sent shockwaves through the galaxy, both literal and metaphorical. Billions of lives snuffed out in an instant, an entire world reduced to debris as a demonstration of imperial power. It was an atrocity of such magnitude that it defied comprehension, and it accomplished exactly the opposite of what Palpatine intended. Instead of terrifying the galaxy into submission, it galvanized the rebellion and turned neutral systems against the Empire. Vitiate observed this with approval. Palpatine's arrogance had led him to overreach, to believe that raw power alone could maintain control. The destruction of Alderaan would be remembered as the moment when the Empire revealed its true nature, when any pretense of bringing order and security was stripped away to reveal the tyranny beneath. It was a mistake that would cost Palpatine dearly, and Vitiate was content to let that mistake play out to its fullest consequences. When Luke and his companions reached the Death Star to rescue Leia, the ancient Emperor watched with particular interest. The confrontation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader was decades in the making, a final duel between former master and apprentice. Vitiate observed as Obi-Wan deliberately allowed Vader to strike him down, becoming one with the Force and taking his first steps into a larger existence as a Force ghost. This sacrifice revealed something important. The Jedi had preserved techniques that even Vitiate did not fully understand. The ability to maintain consciousness after death, to exist as a presence in the Force that could guide and teach the living. This was a power that transcended mere physical immortality. It suggested that the light side of the Force held secrets that even an immortal Sith Emperor had not fully plumbed. But for the moment, Vitiate filed that observation away for future consideration. More immediately relevant was Luke's reaction to witnessing Obi-Wan's death. The young man's grief and anger in that moment opened him to the dark side in ways he did not recognize. The desire for revenge, the pain of loss. These were emotions that could be cultivated and shaped. Luke had taken his first step toward the kind of internal conflict that would define his journey. The Battle of Yavin came as a shock to the Imperial military, but not to Vitiate. He had seen the patterns, recognized that the Death Star's very existence made it a target that the rebellion could not ignore. The station's destruction in a desperate assault, led by Luke Skywalker, represented a massive propaganda victory for the rebellion, and a devastating blow to Imperial prestige. The Empire's ultimate weapon, the physical embodiment of its doctrine of rule through fear, had been destroyed by a handful of starfighters. But more significant to Vitiate was Luke's role in that destruction. The young man had used the Force, trusting in feelings and instinct rather than technology, to make an impossible shot that destroyed the Death Star. That act proved his potential, demonstrated that the Skywalker bloodline's connection to the Force was as powerful as Vitiate had anticipated. Luke Skywalker had announced himself to the galaxy as a Force user, and more importantly, he had announced himself to his father. Vader's reaction to discovering his son's existence was carefully monitored by Vitiate. The ancient Emperor felt the Sith Lord's shock, his immediate obsession with finding Luke, and either turning him to the dark side or destroying him. But beneath that surface reaction, Vitiate sensed something else, a flicker of hope, buried so deep that Vader himself was not consciously aware of it. The possibility that his children had survived meant that he had not lost everything when Padme died, that some piece of his former life might be reclaimed. This internal conflict within Vader represented an opportunity. If properly exploited, it could drive a wedge between Palpatine and his apprentice, creating an opening for Vitiate to either claim Vader as his own servant, or at least ensure that Vader's ultimate fate would destabilize the Empire rather than strengthen it. In the aftermath of Yavin, Vitiate began to more actively deploy his agents and resources. The rebellion's victory had proven they could hurt the Empire, but it had also made them a more visible target for Imperial retaliation. Both sides would be looking for advantages, for new allies and resources to tip the balance. This created opportunities for an outside force to offer assistance while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. Through his network of criminal organizations and mercenary companies, Vitiate began to sell weapons and intelligence to both sides. He ensured that neither side gained too much of an advantage, maintaining a careful balance that would prolong the conflict rather than resolve it. Imperial commanders found themselves aided by mysterious benefactors who provided intelligence on rebel positions. Rebel cells received shipments of weapons from sources they could not trace, gifts that came without obvious strings attached. Both sides benefited from this assistance, and neither realized they were being played by the same intelligence. Vitiate's goal was not to help either faction win, but to ensure that the war continued, burning through resources and lives, weakening both the Empire's military might and the rebellion's moral certainty. Every battle, every casualty, every planet caught in the crossfire served his ultimate purpose. The ancient Emperor also began to reach out more directly to Force-sensitive individuals within both factions. Rebel operatives who showed latent Force abilities found themselves experiencing vivid dreams where a hooded figure offered to teach them powers the Jedi had hoarded for themselves. Imperial officers with Force sensitivity received visions promising them the strength to overthrow their superiors and claim greater authority. These approaches were carefully targeted and individually tailored. Vitiate never revealed his true identity or ultimate goals. He simply appeared as a mysterious benefactor, someone who could offer power and knowledge to those willing to embrace it. Some of these individuals rejected his offers, remaining loyal to their causes, but others accepted, becoming part of his growing network of Force users spread across the galaxy. One such individual was a rebel pilot named Kellen Jorad, who had survived a TIE fighter attack that should have killed him. In the aftermath, he began to experience premonitions, flashes of insight that told him when danger was approaching. These abilities made him an exceptional pilot, but they also frightened him. He had no training in the Force, no framework for understanding what was happening to him. When Vitiate's consciousness touched Kellen's mind during a meditation session, offering to explain and develop his abilities, the pilot was receptive. He began to practice techniques taught to him in dreams, never realizing that his mysterious teacher was an ancient Sith Emperor. To Kellen, the hooded figure was simply a Force ghost, perhaps a Jedi who had died in Order 66 and was now trying to help the rebellion by training a new generation. Through operatives like Kellen, Vitiate gained insight into rebel operations and planning, but more importantly, he was creating a distributed network of Force users who, when the time came, could be activated as a coherent force, serving his interests. They would not know they were serving him until he chose to reveal himself, but by then, they would be too deeply invested in the power he had given them to easily turn back. As the months following the Battle of Yavin stretched into years, the galaxy remained locked in conflict. The rebellion scored occasional victories, but remained on the defensive, constantly relocating their bases to stay ahead of Imperial hunter-killer fleets. The Empire maintained its grip on the core worlds, but found itself stretched thin, trying to control the vast expanses of the Outer Rim. And in the unknown regions, Vitiate continued to build his strength, preparing for the moment when he would finally step out of the shadows and claim what he believed was rightfully his. The Empire strikes back. Darkness recognizes itself. 3 years after the destruction of the Death Star, the galaxy remained embroiled in conflict. The rebellion had grown bolder, establishing a major base on the ice planet Hoth. The Empire had grown more determined, pouring resources into hunting down the rebels and preventing another humiliation like Yavin. And in the spaces between these two great powers, ancient darkness continued to weave its influence. The discovery of the rebel base on Hoth by an Imperial probe droid set in motion a chain of events that would test the Skywalker twins in ways they could not imagine. Vitiate observed as the Empire's assault force, led by Darth Vader himself, descended upon the frozen world. The Battle of Hoth was a devastating defeat for the rebellion, forcing them to evacuate and scatter across the galaxy. But it also served to harden the survivors, transforming them from idealistic rebels into hardened veterans willing to make any sacrifice for their cause. Luke's journey to Dagobah, following Obi-Wan's instructions to seek out Yoda, represented a critical moment in his development. The ancient Jedi Master, having survived in exile for 20 years, was one of the few remaining authorities on Jedi training and philosophy. Under his guidance, Luke would receive the formal instruction that Obi-Wan had only begun to provide. Vitiate watched this training with intense interest. Yoda's methods were traditional, emphasizing patience, emotional control, and connection to the living force. But Vitiate also recognized the limitations in that training. Yoda was teaching Luke to suppress his emotions, to deny the anger and fear that were natural responses to the horrors of war. This suppression created internal pressure that would inevitably seek release, and when it did, the results could be spectacular. More concerning from Vitiate's perspective was Luke's experience in the dark side cave on Dagobah. When the young Jedi confronted the vision of Vader and saw his own face beneath the mask, it represented a moment of dangerous self-awareness. Luke had glimpsed the truth that he and Vader were connected, that the darkness within the Sith Lord existed within himself as well. This recognition could lead Luke toward balance and wisdom, but it could also become a source of fear that paralyzed him at critical moments. The ancient emperor decided it was time to introduce himself more directly into Luke's journey, though still not revealing his true identity or nature. During Luke's meditations on Dagobah, Vitiate began to send visions that complemented and complicated Yoda's teachings. He showed Luke images of ancient Jedi who had embraced passion and emotion without falling to the dark side, suggesting that the rigid dichotomy between light and dark was a false construct imposed by dogma rather than truth. These visions were subtle enough that Luke dismissed them as products of his own subconscious, but they planted seeds of doubt about the absolutism of Jedi teaching. The young man began to question whether the Jedi way was the only path to understanding the Force, whether the teachings of the Order that had failed to prevent its own destruction were truly infallible. Meanwhile, Vader's pursuit of Luke became an obsession that worried Palpatine. The Emperor could sense his apprentice's divided loyalties, could feel the conflict between Vader's desire to turn his son to the dark side and his buried hope that somehow his family might be redeemed. Palpatine began to consider whether Vader had outlived his usefulness, whether Luke might serve better as an apprentice uncomplicated by sentiment and attachments. This tension between master and apprentice was exactly what Vitiate had been hoping to see. He began to very carefully feed information to both sides, ensuring that their confrontation would happen on terms that served his interests. Anonymous tips delivered to rebel intelligence suggested that Vader was becoming unstable, that his obsession with finding Luke might be exploited. Whispers in Vader's dreams suggested that Palpatine feared Luke's potential and might attempt to kill the young man rather than allow him to be turned. The confrontation on Cloud City brought these various threads together in explosive fashion. Lando Calrissian's betrayal of his old friend Han Solo, even though motivated by impossible circumstances, demonstrated how easily the Empire could corrupt and compromise even decent people. Vader's revelation to Luke that he was his father shattered the young man's understanding of his own heritage and destiny, and Luke's decision to throw himself into the abyss rather than join Vader showed a strength of character that impressed even Vitiate. The ancient Emperor watched as Luke fell through the clouds of Bespin, reaching out through the Force to call for help. It was Leia who answered, her own Force sensitivity awakening in response to her brother's desperate need. The siblings had found each other, not yet knowing their true relationship, but connected through the Force in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. In the aftermath of Cloud City, the rebellion was scattered and demoralized. Han Solo had been frozen in carbonite and delivered to Jabba the Hutt. Luke had lost his hand and learned a terrible truth about his father. The Empire seemed to be winning on every front. But Vitiate recognized these setbacks as the necessary hardships that would forge Luke and Leia into the Force users they needed to become to fulfill their potential. During this period, Vitiate began to more actively build his own forces in preparation for his eventual emergence. His eternal fleet was nearly complete, thousands of ships that combined technology from his ancient empire with modern innovations. His army of dark side cultists had grown to number in the tens of thousands, spread across the unknown regions and hidden on forgotten worlds throughout the galaxy. He also began to make contact with Imperial officers and officials who had grown disillusioned with Palpatine's regime. Not the idealistic ones who might join the rebellion, but the ambitious ones who saw the cracks in the Empire and wanted to be positioned to claim power when it inevitably crumbled. These individuals were promised positions of authority in the new order that would follow the Empire's fall, rewards for their loyalty to a master they had never met, and whose true nature they did not understand. One such individual was Grand Admiral Thrawn, the Chiss tactical genius who served the Empire despite not sharing its human-centric ideology. Thrawn was approached by one of Vitiate's agents with an offer of cooperation, intelligence from unknown regions, territories in exchange for information about Imperial fleet movements and strategic planning. Thrawn agreed, seeing it as a mutually beneficial arrangement with what he believed was an independent faction operating beyond the galactic rim. Through Thrawn, Vitiate gained detailed knowledge of Imperial strategy and capabilities. More importantly, he identified weaknesses in the Empire's structure that could be exploited when the time came. Thrawn himself was never directly corrupted or turned against the Empire, but his unknowing cooperation with Vitiate's agents gave the ancient Emperor insights that would prove invaluable in years to come. Luke's training continued even without a formal master. Experiences and hardships became his teachers. The loss of his hand forced him to confront his own vulnerability and mortality. The knowledge of his father's identity made him question his destiny and purpose. Each challenge stripped away another layer of naivety, revealing the steel beneath. But Luke's greatest teacher during this period came from an unexpected source. The Force itself began to speak to him more directly, showing him visions of possible futures and past events he had never witnessed. Some of these visions were genuine insights from the cosmic force. Others were carefully planted by Vitiate, designed to shape Luke's understanding of the Force in ways that would make him more receptive to teachings that blurred the line between light and dark. Leia's own development as a Force user accelerated during this time as well. Though she had no formal training, her natural abilities began to manifest in subtle ways. She developed an almost preternatural ability to read people, to sense when someone was lying or hiding their true intentions. Her political instincts were enhanced by Force sensitivity she did not consciously recognize, making her an increasingly important leader within the rebellion. Vitiate recognized that Leia represented a different kind of potential than her brother. Where Luke was passionate and impulsive, driven by emotion and attachment, Leia was disciplined and strategic, capable of making difficult choices for the greater good. Both approaches to the Force were valuable, and in combination, they could be devastating. If properly motivated, the Skywalker twins might achieve together what neither could accomplish alone. As the year following the Battle of Hoth drew to a close, Vitiate felt the tides of the Force shifting. Critical moments were approaching, decision points that would determine the fate not just of the Skywalker bloodline, but of the entire galaxy. Palpatine was planning something significant, a trap designed to eliminate the rebellion once and for all. Vader was planning to turn or destroy his son, unable to see a third option, and Luke was preparing to rescue his friend from Jabba's palace, unaware that this mission would test him in ways that formal training never could. The ancient Emperor made his own preparations. His agents throughout the galaxy received activation codes and instructions, positioning them to act when the signal came. His eternal fleet assembled in the unknown regions, ready to emerge when the time was right. And Vitiate himself entered a period of deep meditation, gathering his power for the confrontation that was rapidly approaching. The Empire was about to strike back in ways that Palpatine could not anticipate, not just against the rebellion, but against the Emperor himself, as ancient darkness finally prepared to challenge the modern Sith for control of the galaxy. The rescue of Han Solo from Jabba's palace marked the beginning of the end for multiple empires. Luke Skywalker's return to Tatooine demonstrated how much he had grown since leaving as a naive farm boy. He entered Jabba's fortress with confidence and skill, wielding Force powers that suggested significant development even without a formal master. His confrontation with the crime lord ended with Jabba's death and the rescue of his friends, but it also revealed something darker in Luke's demeanor. Vitiate observed Luke's use of Force choke against Jabba's guards with particular interest. This technique was inherently aligned with the dark side, a weapon of fear and domination rather than defense. That Luke employed it without apparent hesitation suggested that his time away from formal Jedi instruction had allowed him to explore aspects of the Force that the Order would have forbidden. The young man was walking a dangerous line between light and dark, and he did not seem fully aware of the precipice beneath his feet. After the rescue, Luke returned to Dagobah to complete his training with Yoda, but the ancient Jedi Master was dying, his centuries-long life finally coming to an end. In their final conversation, Yoda confirmed that Vader was indeed Luke's father, and revealed that there was another Skywalker, though he did not name Leia directly. This revelation would reshape Luke's understanding of his place in the galaxy and his relationship with the Force. Yoda's death and subsequent appearance as a Force ghost alongside Obi-Wan marked a transition in Luke's journey. He was no longer a student, but a Jedi Knight in his own right, albeit one with unconventional training and unorthodox understanding of the Force. The revelation that Leia was his sister added another layer of complexity, connecting him to someone he already cared for deeply and who possessed Force potential equal to his own. But while Luke was processing these revelations, Palpatine was setting his trap. The second Death Star, under construction in orbit above the forest moon of Endor, was deliberately leaked to the rebellion as bait. The Emperor planned to lure the rebel fleet into an ambush where both the Death Star and a massive Imperial fleet would destroy them utterly. It was a strategy designed to eliminate the rebellion in a single devastating blow. Vitiate recognized the Emperor's plan for what it was and saw an opportunity. The convergence of so many powerful individuals and massive military forces at a single location would create a moment of incredible potency in the Force. If properly exploited, this moment could be used to fundamentally reshape the galactic balance of power, but it would require careful timing and precise manipulation of multiple parties. Through his network of agents, Vitiate began feeding information to various factions, ensuring that the Battle of Endor would unfold in ways that served his interests. Imperial commanders received intelligence that made them overconfident, convinced that their trap was foolproof. Rebel strategists received data that made them aware of the trap, but also gave them hope that they could turn it to their advantage by destroying the Death Star while it was still under construction. More significantly, Vitiate began to reach out directly to Vader through the Force. The ancient Emperor had spent years subtly influencing Vader's dreams and meditations, planting seeds of doubt about Palpatine's ultimate intentions. Now, with Luke about to deliver himself directly to his father, Vitiate intensified these efforts. He sent visions showing Vader what would happen if he allowed Palpatine to kill or fully corrupt Luke, images of eternal servitude with no hope of redemption, of living forever in the mechanical suit that served as both life support and prison. Vader felt these visions as a growing unease, a sense that the confrontation with his son at Endor would determine not just Luke's fate, but his own. The conflict within him, between the Sith Lord, who served the Emperor, and the man who had once been Anakin Skywalker, intensified to the point where even Palpatine could not ignore it. The Emperor grew suspicious of his apprentice's loyalty, but was too committed to his plan to change course now. When the Rebel strike team landed on Endor's forest moon to deactivate the shield generator protecting the Death Star, they walked into Palpatine's trap, as expected, but they also received unexpected aid from the Ewoks, the indigenous species who proved far more capable than their appearance suggested. This alliance, facilitated by C-3PO's accidental deification by the primitive tribe, gave the rebels a fighting chance against the Imperial garrison. Luke's decision to surrender himself to Vader, believing he could turn his father back to the light, represented either tremendous courage or suicidal foolishness. Vitiate recognized it as the natural impulse of someone raised on the naive certainty that good could triumph over evil through simple conviction. The young Jedi was about to receive an education in the true complexity of moral choices and the price of redemption. The confrontation in Palpatine's throne room aboard the second Death Star became the nexus point where multiple destinies converged. Luke stood before the Emperor, who revealed the full scope of his trap and mocked the young Jedi's faith in his friends. The Rebel fleet arrived to find the Death Star's shields still operational, and an entire Imperial fleet waiting for them. And Vader stood between his master and his son, torn between decades of servitude and the buried hope that something of Anakin Skywalker might still remain within the monster he had become. But there was a fourth presence in that throne room, one that none of the three primary actors recognized. Vitiate had extended his consciousness across the galaxy to observe and, if necessary, intervene in this critical moment. He watched as Palpatine goaded Luke into attacking, feeding on the young man's anger and fear. He felt Luke's surrender to rage as he retrieved his lightsaber and struck at the Emperor, only to be blocked by Vader's intervention. The duel between father and son was exactly what Palpatine wanted, a demonstration of Luke's vulnerability to the dark side and an opportunity to corrupt or destroy him. But it was also an opportunity for Vader to prove his loyalty, or to make a different choice. As the battle raged, both in space around them and on the forest moon below, the confrontation in the throne room became a microcosm of the larger struggle between light and dark. Luke's moment of dark triumph, when he gave in to his rage and struck down Vader, severing his father's mechanical hand, represented a critical juncture. In that moment, he stood on the edge of the abyss, one more step away from becoming exactly what he had fought against. But then he saw Vader's severed hand and looked at his own mechanical replacement, recognizing the parallel. He realized that the path Palpatine was offering would transform him into his father, another broken servant enslaved to hatred and pain. His refusal to kill Vader and his declaration that he was a Jedi like his father before him represented a rejection of the easy path, a choice to embrace the light even at the cost of his life. Palpatine responded with Force lightning, torturing Luke as punishment for his defiance and as a demonstration to Vader of what happened to those who refused the Emperor's will. This was the moment that Vitiate had been waiting for, but it was also a moment when he recognized that direct intervention might not be necessary. Vader, watching his son being tortured to death by his master, finally made the choice that he had been avoiding for over 20 years. He grabbed Palpatine and threw him into the reactor shaft, destroying the Emperor at the cost of his own life, as the Force lightning ravaged his life support systems. Vitiate observed this act of redemption with mixed feelings. On one hand, Palpatine's death eliminated his primary rival for control of the galaxy. On the other hand, Vader's sacrifice and return to the light suggested that even the most corrupted individuals might be reclaimed, a dangerous precedent that complicated future corruption efforts. But the immediate opportunity was clear. With Palpatine dead, the Empire would be thrown into chaos. The Sith, who had ruled the galaxy for over 20 years, was gone, and there was no clear successor. The rebellion would claim victory and attempt to establish a new republic, but they would be dealing with an empire that still controlled most of the galaxy's military forces and infrastructure. The resulting power vacuum and inevitable struggle would create exactly the conditions Vitiate needed to reveal himself. As the second Death Star exploded, destroyed by the rebel fleet once the shields went down, Vitiate began to mobilize his forces. His Eternal Fleet received orders to prepare for immediate deployment. His agents throughout the galaxy were activated with instructions to begin the next phase of his plan. And the ancient Emperor himself prepared to finally step out of the shadows and claim what he believed was rightfully his. But he also took note of something unexpected. Luke's journey had shown him that the Skywalker bloodline possessed not just power, but resilience, the ability to resist corruption and find redemption even in the darkest circumstances. This quality would need to be accounted for in future plans. The twins could not simply be corrupted or controlled. They would need to be carefully managed, and perhaps ultimately eliminated, if they proved impossible to turn or neutralize. The galaxy celebrated the Empire's defeat, not realizing that the true war was only beginning. Palpatine had been merely one Sith Lord, powerful but ultimately mortal. Vitiate was something else entirely, an immortal consciousness that had survived for over 3,000 years, that had already witnessed the rise and fall of multiple galactic civilizations. The rebellion had defeated one emperor, but they had no idea that an even older and more patient one was about to make his presence known. The New Republic and the Eternal Empire. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Endor, the galaxy erupted in celebration. Imperial strongholds fell as their garrisons learned of the Emperor's death and the second Death Star's destruction. The rebellion transformed itself into the New Republic, establishing a provisional government and beginning the complex process of demilitarization and reconstruction. Mon Mothma, Leia Organa, and other rebel leaders worked tirelessly to transform a military alliance into a functioning galactic government. But the transition was far from smooth. While the Empire had lost its head, its body remained very much alive. Moffs and Grand Admirals who had commanded sectors and fleets did not simply surrender because the Emperor had fallen. Many of them declared themselves independent warlords, carving out their own territories and fighting both the New Republic and each other for control of the galaxy's resources. Vitiate watched this fragmentation with satisfaction. The galaxy was descending into exactly the kind of chaos he needed. The New Republic was too weak and inexperienced to impose order across all of known space. The Imperial remnants were too divided and self-interested to unite under a single banner. And the common people, exhausted by decades of war, just wanted peace and stability regardless of who provided it. 1 year after Endor, Vitiate decided the time had come to reveal himself, but he did not do so through conventional conquest or military assault. Instead, he began with a message broadcast simultaneously across thousands of worlds, penetrating both Republic and Imperial communication networks with ease that suggested technology far more advanced than either faction possessed. The broadcast showed a hooded figure whose face was obscured by shadow. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of ages, resonating with power that made even recording equipment struggle to accurately capture its quality. He did not introduce himself as Vitiate, did not use any name that historians might recognize. Instead, he called himself the Eternal Emperor, ruler of an empire that had existed for thousands of years in the unknown regions. His message was simple and terrifying in its implications. The galaxy's current chaos was unnecessary and destructive. Both the New Republic and the Imperial remnants were failing to provide the stability and order that civilization required. The Eternal Emperor offered a third option: submit to his rule, acknowledge his sovereignty over all of known space, and in return receive peace, prosperity, and the benefits of technology and knowledge that predated the Republic itself. To demonstrate he was not making idle threats, the Eternal Fleet emerged from hyperspace simultaneously above a dozen key worlds in both Republic and Imperial territory. These ships, combining ancient Sith design with modern technology, far exceeded anything the galaxy had seen before. They made no hostile moves, simply assumed orbit, and waited, a demonstration of power that made it clear resistance would be futile. The New Republic leadership was thrown into crisis. They had just finished celebrating victory over the Empire, and now they faced an even more powerful threat that they knew virtually nothing about. The Imperial warlords were equally shocked, suddenly realizing that their territorial disputes were meaningless in the face of a force that could deploy fleets across the galaxy simultaneously. Luke Skywalker, now attempting to rebuild the Jedi Order, felt the disturbance in the force that accompanied Vitiate's emergence. The ancient Emperor's presence was like a wound in the force, a void of darkness so deep that it seemed to consume light itself. Luke recognized immediately that this was no ordinary Force user, no fallen Jedi or ambitious Sith apprentice. This was something ancient and terrible, a power that made even Palpatine seem almost mortal by comparison. Leia, now a senator in the New Republic and a key leader in their government, received reports of the Eternal Fleet's deployment with growing alarm. But she also felt something through the Force, a presence that was trying to reach her, to establish a connection. She did not understand what she was feeling or why, but her instincts told her that this Eternal Emperor represented a threat even more dangerous than the one they had just defeated. Vitiate's initial offer of peaceful submission came with a deadline. He gave the galaxy's various factions one standard month to consider their options. After that deadline, he would begin to actively assert his claim to rulership, and those who resisted would be treated as rebels against legitimate authority. It was the same tactic empires had used for millennia: offer peace, but make clear that the price of refusal was annihilation. During that month of grace, various factions responded differently to the threat. Some imperial warlords, recognizing they could not resist this new power, immediately offered their submission in exchange for being allowed to maintain their current territories as governors under the Eternal Empire. Some Republic worlds, war-weary and desperate for stability, began to seriously consider whether accepting this new emperor might be preferable to continued chaos and conflict. But others recognized the offer for what it was: slavery dressed up in promises of order and prosperity. Luke, Leia, and the core rebellion leadership understood that submitting to Vitiate would mean abandoning everything they had fought for. The new Republic, fragile as it was, represented democracy and freedom. The Eternal Empire represented only absolute authority and the will of an immortal tyrant. Luke decided he needed to confront this threat directly to understand what they were truly facing. Using the Force, he attempted to reach out to the Eternal Emperor to gauge his intentions and capabilities. What he found terrified him. The consciousness he touched was vast and ancient, filled with knowledge and power accumulated over millennia. But it was also completely devoid of compassion or restraint. A predator's mind that viewed all other beings as potential tools or obstacles. In that moment of contact, Vitiate recognized Luke as well. He felt the young Jedi's power and potential, and he made Luke an offer through the Force. Join the Eternal Empire as its chief enforcer. Bring order to the galaxy through strength, rather than the weakness of democracy and debate. In return, Luke would receive training in Force techniques that no living Jedi knew, power sufficient to protect everyone he cared about, and a position of authority second only to the Emperor himself. Luke's refusal was immediate and absolute. He would not trade freedom for security, would not become the enforcer for a tyrant, no matter how powerful. But Vitiate's offer had served its purpose. It had shown Luke that the Emperor knew about him, was interested in him, and considered him valuable enough to attempt recruitment rather than simple destruction. That knowledge was both flattering and terrifying. As the deadline approached, the new Republic mobilized what military forces it could gather. They reached out to sympathetic Imperial warlords, offering alliance against this common threat. Many refused, still too bitter about their defeat at Endor, to ally with their former enemies. But some agreed, recognizing that Vitiate's Eternal Empire represented an existential threat to everyone's autonomy. When the deadline expired, Vitiate made his move. The Eternal Fleet emerged from hyperspace above Coruscant itself, the capital of both the Old Republic and Palpatine's Empire. Thousands of ships filled the sky, a demonstration of military might that exceeded anything the New Republic could field. But the ancient Emperor did not immediately attack. Instead, he sent a second message. He offered Coruscant a choice: accept his rule and continue to serve as the galactic capital under the Eternal Empire, or resist and be reduced to rubble as an example to any other world that might consider defiance. The New Republic government, evacuated to Coruscant after Endor, had hours to decide the fate of trillions of lives. The debate in the Senate was fierce. Some senators argued for submission, pointing out that they could not possibly win a military confrontation against such overwhelming force. Others argued for resistance, insisting that freedom was worth fighting for even if the odds of victory were microscopic. And some argued for evacuation, suggesting they abandon Coruscant but continue to resist from other strongholds. Leia Organa, now one of the most influential voices in the Senate, made an impassioned speech. She spoke of her experience fighting the Empire, of the cost of surrendering freedom for security. She acknowledged that the odds were terrible, but argued that the New Republic had faced impossible odds before and prevailed. If they submitted to Vitiate now, they would be betraying everyone who had died fighting for freedom over the past decades. Her words swayed the Senate. By a narrow margin, they voted to resist. The The New Republic government began immediate evacuation of Coruscant, moving their capital to the heavily fortified world of Mon Cala. But they also sent a message to the Eternal Emperor, clearly stating their refusal to submit and their determination to fight for galactic freedom. Vitiate's response was measured and terrible. He did not destroy Coruscant as he had threatened. Instead, he simply occupied it, his forces landing on the planet's surface and taking control of key infrastructure with minimal resistance. The message was clear. He did not need to destroy to conquer. He had such overwhelming force that resistance was simply bypassed rather than crushed. But he also made an example of one world that resisted. Sullust, a key industrial world loyal to the New Republic. The Eternal Fleet bombarded the planet from orbit, reducing its shipyards and factories to slag in a matter of hours. Millions died in the assault, and billions more were left homeless and terrified. Vitiate's message was clear. He preferred to rule through fear rather than annihilation, but he was capable of either. The galaxy faced a choice that would define the next generation: submit to ancient tyranny and accept stability purchased through slavery, or resist against impossible odds and likely face annihilation. It was the same choice the rebellion had faced when confronting Palpatine's empire, but the stakes were somehow even higher because the enemy was so much older, so much more patient, and so much more powerful. The eternal conflict. A galaxy divided. The war that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had experienced before. It was not a conventional conflict between territorial powers or an ideological struggle between democracy and fascism. It was a war of survival against an enemy that could not be negotiated with, could not be truly defeated through conventional means, and would never ever stop until he had claimed absolute dominion over everything. The New Republic fought desperately to maintain control of key systems, while also trying to govern and provide for their people. They were hampered by limited resources, war-weary populations, and the constant threat that more worlds would defect to the Eternal Empire in exchange for peace. Every victory was temporary, every defeat potentially catastrophic. The Imperial warlords found themselves in an even more difficult position. Many had initially believed they could negotiate favorable terms with Vitiate, maintaining their territories in exchange for nominal submission. But the Eternal Emperor had no interest in allowing semi-autonomous regions. He demanded absolute control, and those warlords who refused found themselves targeted for elimination just as thoroughly as the New Republic. This created an interesting development. Former enemies found themselves fighting side by side against a common threat. New Republic fleets coordinated with Imperial Star Destroyers to defend worlds from Eternal Fleet assault. Rebel commandos worked alongside Imperial officers to sabotage Vitiate's supply lines. The galaxy's factional divisions began to blur in the face of existential threat. Luke Skywalker became a central figure in the resistance against Vitiate. His power in the Force, while still developing, made him one of the few individuals who could potentially challenge the Eternal Emperor's dark side wielders. But Luke also recognized that he needed to rebuild the Jedi Order if they were to have any hope of providing Force users capable of countering Vitiate's agents. He established a new Jedi Academy on the remote world of Yavin 4, ironically the same location where Nagasato had hidden millennia ago after the fall of the first Sith Empire. There, Luke began to train a new generation of Jedi, including students who had survived Order 66 and younger Force sensitives who had emerged during the war years. But Luke's approach to training differed from the old Jedi Order in significant ways. Having learned from his own experiences and from the failures that led to the Order's destruction, he emphasized emotional awareness rather than suppression, encouraged students to acknowledge their fears and attachments rather than deny them. This made his Jedi more resilient and adaptable, but it also made them more vulnerable to dark side temptation. Vitiate recognized this vulnerability and began specifically targeting Luke's students. His agents would approach young Jedi and offer them power and knowledge that Luke's training did not provide. Some resisted these temptations, remaining true to the light side. But others fell, becoming dark side adepts who served the Eternal Empire while believing they were simply embracing a more complete understanding of the Force. One of Luke's most talented students, a young woman named Kira Ven, became a particular target of Vitiate's corruption efforts. She was powerful in the Force, skilled with a lightsaber, and had a natural gift for leadership that made her popular among her fellow students. But she also carried deep anger toward the Empire for destroying her homeworld during the Galactic Civil War. Vitiate's agents reached out to Kira, showing her that the Eternal Empire was fighting against the Imperial remnants, just as she wanted to. They suggested that Vitiate's absolute rule might be necessary to prevent future wars and the suffering they caused. They taught her dark side techniques that amplified her combat abilities while assuring her that power itself was not evil, only the intentions behind its use. By the time Luke realized Kira was being corrupted, it was too late. She left the academy, taking several other students with her, and joined the Eternal Empire as a dark side enforcer. Her defection was a devastating blow to Luke, both personally and strategically, proof that even his new approach to Jedi training was not sufficient to protect against Vitiate's ancient knowledge and patient manipulation. Leia faced her own challenges in the New Republic Senate. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, more and more senators began to question whether continued resistance was worth the cost. Peace factions emerged, arguing that negotiating terms of submission might save lives even if it meant surrendering freedom. Each debate grew more heated, each vote more contentious. But Leia also began to develop her own Force abilities more deliberately during this period. She sought out Luke for training, and though her political responsibilities limited how much time she could devote to it, she proved to be a quick study. Her connection to the Force manifested differently than Luke's, less focused on combat and more on influence and perception. But it was no less powerful for that difference. One significant battle during this period occurred over the planet Quat, home to one of the galaxy's most important shipyards. Both the New Republic and several Imperial warlords had major forces stationed there, making it a critical industrial center. When the Eternal Fleet moved to occupy Quat, the defenders mounted a desperate resistance. The Battle of Quat lasted for 3 weeks, with fighting in orbit and on the planet's surface. Luke personally led Jedi Knights in combat against Vitiate's dark side adepts, including his former student Kira Ven. The confrontation between Master and fallen apprentice was painful for both, ending in stalemate when Kira retreated rather than pushed their duel to a lethal conclusion. Ultimately, Quat fell to the Eternal Empire, despite fierce resistance. The shipyards were captured largely intact, giving Vitiate access to modern ship construction facilities to complement his ancient fleet. But the defenders evacuated much of the workforce and technical expertise, denying him the full industrial capacity he had sought. The fall of Quat marked a turning point in the war. It demonstrated that conventional military resistance against the Eternal Fleet was ultimately futile. Vitiate simply had too many resources, too much technological advantage, and too much patience to be defeated through attrition. If the New Republic and their allies were going to survive, they would need to find a different approach. The search for ancient knowledge. Luke realized that defeating Vitiate would require more than military might, or even Force ability. He needed to understand who and what the Eternal Emperor truly was, to discover if there was any weakness that could be exploited. This led him to begin a quest for ancient Jedi and Sith knowledge, searching for any information about Vitiate's original rise to power and the techniques he had used to achieve immortality. His search led him to forgotten Jedi temples and hidden Sith tombs scattered across the galaxy. On Ossus, he discovered ancient Jedi archives that had survived the centuries, containing references to the original Sith Empire and the wars that had been fought against it. On Korriban, he braved the tombs of ancient Sith lords, seeking knowledge about Vitiate's origins and the ritual that had granted him immortality. What Luke discovered horrified him. Vitiate had achieved immortality not through mastery of the Force, in any enlightened sense, but through consuming the life force of thousands of Sith lords and an entire planet's worth of living beings. His consciousness was sustained by stolen life, making him something fundamentally different from a normal Force user. He was more akin to a cancer, a parasitic intelligence that fed on death and suffering. But Luke also discovered something potentially useful, references to ancient Jedi techniques that had been used to sever Force users from their connection to the Force itself. These techniques had been forbidden by the Jedi Order because they were considered too dangerous and too cruel, but they represented one of the few methods that might actually harm Vitiate. If his immortality depended on his connection to the Force, then severing that connection might kill him, or at least weaken him enough to be defeated. Learning these techniques required Luke to delve into aspects of the Force that made him deeply uncomfortable. The line between using dark side knowledge to fight darkness and becoming dark yourself was thin and treacherous. He consulted with Force ghosts of Obi-Wan and Yoda, seeking their guidance on whether this path was justified. Their counsel was divided. Yoda warned that pursuing such dangerous knowledge, even with good intentions, risked Luke's fall to the dark side. Obi-Wan argued that desperate times called for desperate measures, and that Luke's character was strong enough to resist corruption. In the end, Luke decided to proceed, but to take precautions against falling himself. He shared his discoveries with Leia, and together they began to formulate a plan. If they could get close enough to Vitiate to use these Force-severing techniques, they might be able to kill him permanently. But approaching the Eternal Emperor was virtually impossible. He was protected by layers of security, fleets of warships, and armies of dark side adepts. They would need to find a way to draw him out, to create a situation where he would expose himself to attack. Meanwhile, Vitiate's empire continued to expand. More worlds fell under his control, either through conquest or submission. The New Republic was pushed back to a core of fiercely loyal systems, operating more as a resistance movement than a legitimate government. The various imperial warlords were either absorbed into the Eternal Empire or destroyed, their territories carved up and integrated into Vitiate's domains. But Vitiate made a strategic error during this period, one born from his very nature as an ancient intelligence trying to rule a modern galaxy. He was so focused on military conquest and political control that he underestimated the power of information and communication networks in the modern age. Where his previous empires had been built on physical conquest and direct control, the modern galaxy was interconnected in ways he did not fully appreciate. Rebel intelligence operatives, working with defectors from the Eternal Empire, began to piece together information about Vitiate's true nature and his past atrocities. They discovered evidence of the ritual that had destroyed Nathema, of the countless lives he had consumed over millennia, of the dark side cults that sustained his immortality through regular sacrifices. This information was compiled into a comprehensive report and broadcast across the galaxy simultaneously, penetrating even Eternal Empire communication networks. The revelation of Vitiate's true nature shocked many worlds that had submitted to his rule. They had believed they were accepting the governance of an ancient but legitimate ruler. Learning that he was essentially a predator that fed on death caused significant unrest. Protests erupted on occupied worlds. Some Eternal Empire officers, horrified by what their emperor truly was, defected to the New Republic with valuable intelligence. Vitiate responded to this information warfare with brutal crackdowns, but the damage was done. His empire, while still militarily dominant, had lost the veneer of legitimacy it had briefly enjoyed. The war transformed from a struggle between factions into something more primal, the galaxy fighting for survival against a predator that would never stop consuming until nothing remained. The final confrontation. 3 years into the war against the Eternal Empire, Luke and Leia put their desperate plan into motion. They would offer Vitiate something he could not resist, themselves. Through intermediaries, they sent a message to the Eternal Emperor, proposing a meeting on neutral ground. They would submit to his rule and serve as his enforcers throughout the galaxy, bringing their followers into the Eternal Empire peacefully, but only if Vitiate would meet with them personally to negotiate terms. It was an obvious trap, and Vitiate knew it, but he also recognized that even a trap could be turned to advantage. If he could capture or kill the Skywalker twins, the resistance would collapse. Their symbolic value as heroes of the rebellion and leaders of the New Republic made them linchpins of the opposition. With them gone or turned, the galaxy would lose hope. More than that, Vitiate remained fascinated by the Skywalker bloodline. Anakin had been the chosen one, a being of immense power who had brought balance to the Force by destroying both the Jedi Order and the Sith, if only temporarily. Luke and Leia carried that same potential, that same connection to the Force that made them uniquely valuable. If Vitiate could corrupt them, he would gain servants whose power might eventually rival his own. If he could not corrupt them, consuming their life force as he had done to countless others might grant him a significant increase in power. The meeting was arranged to take place on a remote space station in neutral territory, far from any military forces on either side. Both parties agreed to come with minimal security, though everyone understood that both Luke and Vitiate would be far more dangerous than any army either could bring. When the Skywalker twins arrived at the station, they found Vitiate waiting for them in a meditation chamber. For the first time, they saw the Eternal Emperor's true form, no longer hidden behind holograms or shadowy broadcasts. He appeared as a pale, gaunt humanoid, whose eyes glowed with dark side energy, wearing robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The confrontation began not with violence, but with conversation. Vitiate was genuinely curious about the twins, wanted to understand what made them special beyond their genetic inheritance. He questioned them about their experiences, their understanding of the Force, their reasons for resisting his rule when submission would bring peace. Luke spoke of freedom, of the value of choice and self-determination. He argued that peace purchased through slavery was worthless, that sentient beings needed the ability to make their own decisions, even if those decisions led to conflict. Leia spoke of hope, of humanity's capacity for growth and change, of the importance of allowing civilizations to develop naturally, rather than being forced into a mold dictated by an immortal tyrant. Vitiate listened to their arguments with something approaching genuine interest. He had lived so long, had seen so many civilizations rise and fall, that he rarely encountered perspectives that surprised him. But the twins' absolute conviction that freedom was worth any price, even death, represented a worldview he fundamentally could not comprehend. To him, survival and power were the only values that mattered. Freedom was an illusion that weak beings clung to for comfort. The philosophical debate shifted to the Force itself. Vitiate explained his understanding of the Force as a tool to be mastered, a source of power that had no inherent moral character. The Jedi's insistence on the light side and the Sith's embrace of the dark were both arbitrary limitations, he argued. True mastery meant using whatever aspects of the Force served your purposes without being constrained by dogma. Luke countered that the Force was not merely a tool, but a living energy field that reflected and responded to the intentions of those who used it. The light side represented connection, compassion, and preservation of life. The dark side represented domination, hatred, and consumption of life. These were not arbitrary categories, but fundamental aspects of the Force's nature. By consuming so many lives to sustain his immortality, Vitiate had made himself into an abomination, something that existed in opposition to the Force's natural balance. The conversation reached an impasse, and both sides recognized that only conflict would resolve their disagreement. But before the fight began, Vitiate made one final offer: join him, learn from his millennia of experience, help him bring true order to a galaxy that would otherwise tear itself apart through endless conflict. In exchange, he would grant them power beyond anything they had imagined, and positions of authority in his empire. The twins' rejection was simultaneous and absolute. They ignited their lightsabers and attacked. What followed was a battle that tested the limits of Force ability. Luke and Leia fought in perfect synchronization, their connection as twins allowing them to coordinate without words. They used every technique Luke had learned from his studies of ancient Jedi knowledge, every trick that Leia had developed through her political battles and Force training. But Vitiate was something beyond anything they had faced before. His mastery of the Force came from millennia of study and practice. He wielded dark side powers that seemed to violate the laws of physics themselves, tearing reality with storms of lightning, crushing metal bulkheads with casual gestures, moving faster than thought. And beneath all his combat prowess was his immortality, his stolen life force that allowed him to shrug off wounds that would kill any normal being. The battle raged through the space station, destroying sections as the combatants unleashed their full power. Luke managed to wound Vitiate multiple times with his lightsaber, but the Emperor barely seemed to notice. Leia used battle meditation to coordinate their attacks and defend against Vitiate's mental assaults, but the strain of resisting his ancient will was overwhelming. The turning point came when Luke managed to implement the Force-severing technique he had learned from the ancient Jedi archives. It required perfect concentration and physical contact with his target, conditions almost impossible to achieve in combat against a foe like Vitiate. But when Leia created an opening with a massive Force push that momentarily staggered the Emperor, Luke seized the opportunity. He placed his hand on Vitiate's chest and channeled the Force through himself, not to attack, but to sever, to cut the Emperor's connection to the dark side energy that sustained his immortality. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Luke felt Vitiate's vast consciousness, the accumulated knowledge and stolen lives of millennia, all of it sustained by an unending hunger for power. The severing technique worked, but not completely. Luke succeeded in weakening Vitiate's connection to the Force, disrupting the flows of stolen energy that sustained his immortality. The Emperor screamed, a sound of pure rage and pain that shattered viewports and buckled metal. His form began to wither, the dark side energy that had preserved him for thousands of years, suddenly no longer sufficient to maintain his existence. But Vitiate was not defeated so easily. Even wounded, even dying, he was still among the most powerful Force users in the galaxy. With his remaining strength, he attacked both twins simultaneously, unleashing a barrage of Force lightning so intense it burned through their defenses. Luke and Leia fell, their bodies smoking, barely alive. Vitiate staggered toward them, intending to consume their life force to restore his damaged connection to the Force, but he had underestimated their resilience and their desperation. Luke, gathering the last of his strength, reached out through the Force not to Vitiate, but to his sister. Their connection as twins, always strong, became something more in that moment. They joined their powers in a way that neither could have achieved alone, creating a feedback loop that amplified their abilities exponentially. Together, they delivered a final Force push that hurled Vitiate through the wall of the space station and out into the void. Without his full power, without the stolen life force that had sustained him, the Emperor could not survive exposure to vacuum. His physical form disintegrated, consumed by the dark side energies he had relied on for so long, But even in death, Vitiate's consciousness refused to disperse. His essence, that ancient and terrible intelligence, scattered across the galaxy, fragments of his awareness clinging to dark side nexuses and artifacts. He was not truly destroyed, but dispersed, his immortality preserving him in a form that was no longer capable of direct action, but remained aware, suffering, unable to die. Luke and Leia survived the encounter, barely. They were rescued by New Republic forces who had been waiting at a distance, despite the agreement for minimal security. The news that the Eternal Emperor had been defeated, even if not fully destroyed, spread across the galaxy with the speed of hope, long deferred. Aftermath. A galaxy forever changed. The death of Vitiate's physical form and the dissolution of his consciousness had immediate and dramatic effects. The Eternal Fleet, which had been controlled through a combination of advanced automation and direct force manipulation by the Emperor, became inert. Without Vitiate's will to guide them, the massive warship simply stopped, hanging in orbit above the worlds they had been occupying or drifting in space, where their last orders had taken them. The dark side adepts, who had served the Eternal Empire, found themselves suddenly without direction. Some, like Kira, experienced something like awakening, realizing with horror what they had become and what they had done. Others doubled down on their commitment to darkness, fragmenting into various dark side cults and organizations that would plague the galaxy for decades to come. The New Republic, battered but unbroken, began the process of reconstruction for the second time in a decade. But this time, they were more cautious, more aware of the threats that could emerge from unknown space. They established exploration fleets to map the unknown regions, to identify any other ancient threats that might be lurking in the darkness. Luke's Jedi Order, depleted by defections and casualties during the war, nevertheless survived. The experience of fighting Vitiate and his agents had taught Luke valuable lessons about training force users. He implemented new safeguards, new approaches to identifying and resisting dark side corruption. The Order would remain smaller and more selective than in the old Republic era, but also more resilient and adaptable. Leia continued her work in the Senate, but with a new sense of urgency about the need for galactic unity and preparedness. She advocated for maintaining a strong defensive fleet and for intelligence services dedicated to monitoring force-sensitive threats. Her experiences had convinced her that democracy needed to be protected by more than just ideals. It needed practical security measures. But the galaxy's greatest concern was whether Vitiate was truly gone or merely dormant. Force-sensitive individuals throughout known space occasionally reported feeling something in the darkness, a malevolent awareness that watched and waited. Luke and Leia both sensed these echoes of the Eternal Emperor, fragments of his consciousness that persisted in dark side locations. They came to understand that their victory had been incomplete. Vitiate's immortality was too fundamental, too deeply embedded in the dark side itself, to be fully erased by mortal action. The best they had achieved was to scatter his essence, to reduce him from an active threat to a background presence, a shadow that might never fully fade. This realization led to the establishment of a new Jedi tradition, the Watchers. These were Force users, specifically trained to monitor dark side locations and artifacts, to identify and contain any signs of Vitiate's consciousness attempting to reconstitute itself. It was a burden that would be passed down through generations, the eternal vigilance required to prevent the ancient Emperor from ever fully returning. The Skywalker bloodline continued through the next generation. Luke eventually married and had a son, Ben, named after Obi-Wan Kenobi. Leia's son with Han Solo carried the same name in a different timeline, but in this reality affected by Vitiate's presence. Their family dynamics were shaped by different pressures and experiences. These children would grow up in a galaxy scarred by the Eternal Empire, shaped by parents who had faced and defeated an immortal tyrant. but they would also grow up knowing that the threat was not truly gone, merely dormant. Vitiate's legacy was not just the physical destruction his empire had caused, but the knowledge that ancient evil could return, that the past was never truly dead, and that every generation would need to remain vigilant against threats that might emerge from the darkness between the stars. Conclusion: the eternal shadow. What if Vitiate had ruled the Skywalker era? This question takes us down a path where the immortal Sith Emperor, having survived his canonical defeat, positioned himself as a shadow behind the shadows of the entire galactic saga. His presence would have transformed every major event, adding layers of manipulation and ancient malevolence to conflicts that were already complex and tragic. The Clone Wars become not just Palpatine's machination, but a testing ground for two Sith Lords, each positioning themselves for ultimate power. Order 66 and the rise of the Empire create opportunities for Vitiate to build his forces, while the galaxy's attention is focused elsewhere. The original trilogy's heroism is complicated by an even older threat waiting to emerge. Most significantly, the victories of the rebellion become hollow when a far more powerful empire reveals itself. The destruction of the Death Star and the defeat of Palpatine are merely preludes to a war against an enemy who has already survived for over 3,000 years and who will never truly die. In this alternate timeline, the Skywalker saga becomes a multi-generational struggle, not against tyranny alone, but against the very concept of immortal evil. Luke and Leia's victory is not clean or complete. It is the kind of hard-won survival that comes with knowing the battle is never truly over, that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. The themes of Star Wars are amplified through this lens. The struggle between light and dark becomes not just ideological, but existential. The importance of choice and free will is highlighted when facing an enemy who has had millennia to perfect his manipulations. The power of hope and connection is tested against an immortality purchased through the consumption of countless lives. Vitiate's presence in the Skywalker era would have made the galaxy a darker, more dangerous place, but it would also have revealed the true depths of heroism that characters like Luke, Leia, Han, and countless others were capable of displaying. Their victories would mean more because they were achieved against impossible odds, against an enemy who by all rights should have been unstoppable. The fragmented consciousness of Vitiate, scattered but aware, suffering but unable to die, represents a final horror that is somehow fitting for such a character. His immortality, which he viewed as his greatest achievement, becomes his eternal punishment. He exists but cannot act, aware but unable to influence, watching as the galaxy he sought to rule moves beyond his reach. For the heroes who defeated him, knowledge of this incomplete victory would be a heavy burden to bear. But it would also be a source of pride, proof that even ancient evil, even immortal tyranny, could be resisted and reduced, if not eliminated. Their children and grandchildren would inherit both the warning and the inspiration of their battle against the eternal Emperor. This is how Vitiate's rule over the Skywalker era might have played out. Not as a simple replacement of one villain with another, but as the introduction of a threat so ancient and patient that it would require everything the heroes of Star Wars had to offer, and then demand even more. If you've enjoyed this journey through an alternate Star Wars timeline where ancient darkness overshadowed even the Empire's tyranny, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating comprehensive deep dives into Star Wars lore that explore the galaxy far, far away from every possible angle. Whether we're examining canonical history or alternate possibilities like this one, the goal remains the same: to create content that both informs and allows you to drift off into peaceful sleep while immersed in the stories we love. The Star Wars universe is vast enough to contain infinite possibilities, and channels like this exist to explore them all. From ancient Sith to modern heroes, from canonical events to speculative alternatives, there's always more to discover and discuss. Thank you for joining me on this particular journey, and may the Force be with you, always.